In this third episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, entitled Ghosts of Illyria, the Enterprise is investigating the Illyrian colony of Hediment 9. The humanoid species on the colony, known as the Illyrians, disappeared some time ago. They were unable to join the Federation due to the fact that they dabbled in a spot of genetic engineering to enhance themselves, something that's outlawed in the Federation. On the planet's surface, several Enterprise crew members, including Pike, Spock, and Una, have to curtail their investigations and research due to some pretty serious ion storms that are getting very close. But Spock manages to find a large cache of journals about the Illyrians, which he looks forward to reading to find out more about them. Pike gives the order for everyone to return to the rendezvous point due to the oncoming storms, but there's an issue with the transporter. It struggles to provide sufficient power to beam through the interference. Chief Kyle works with Chief Engineer Hemmer to boost the power, and they manage to transport Una and several other members of the landing party aboard. But Pike and Spock are stranded on the surface and forced to take shelter until the storm dies down. Later, Ortegas notices a crew member acting strangely in the corridors of the ship. He's complaining about how it's too dark inside. He wants to feel the light on his skin, to which Ortegas replies, "Whatever tweaks your freak, pal." Yeah, once again, modern Star Trek writes character dialogue in an entirely contemporary Millennial or Generation Z fashion. These people do not speak like 23rd century Star Trek characters. They speak like the young hipsters of today. It's utterly wince-inducing, especially considering Star Trek is supposed to be highbrow intellectual science fiction. Anyway, as you may have guessed, this is the requisite virus episode of the show, which pretty much every Star Trek series does at some point. The crew is infected by some unknown contagion, and they're all acting a bit weird. So there's shades of the original series episode The Naked Time, or The Next Generation's The Naked Now. This time, however, it appears that the crew are all being driven mad by some kind of strange addiction to light. Una, number 1, also notices she's affected in a similar manner. However, her infection doesn't seem to last like it does with the rest of the crew, as she oddly is the only crew member to overcome the infection by herself. So Dr. Mbenga and Nurse Chapel have a great deal to do in this episode, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, how to look after the crew, and a means of developing a cure. The biofilters of the transporter appeared to bring back something with the away team, which shouldn't have happened. More on that later. In the meantime, the infection, or virus, or whatever it is, appears to spread through beams of light and light sources, which are literally everywhere, obviously. Soon, it's not just the landing party members who are infected, as the illness spreads ship-wide. Everyone infected appears to exhibit extreme vitamin D deficiency. Now, just so you're aware, this episode gives us some phrases that have entered the popular lexicon since 2020. Terms like contact tracing and lockdown. Yeah. Anyway, back on the planet, Pike and Spock are holed up in the library, sheltering from the storm. Spock's research reveals that this particular group of Illyrians wanted to join the Federation and attempted to reverse their genetic engineering so they could do so. While there, they witnessed some strange plasma creatures flying around in the storm. But then it appears these creatures are coming after them. Later, on the Enterprise, Hemmer goes nuts, under the influence, and tries to beam a piece of the molten core of the planet onto the ship, which would obviously kill him. Una has to stun him, and then suddenly she lifts him up using strength she really shouldn't have. So how is she doing this? Also, just as a quick aside, this really looks like a dummy. So she has to come clean to Mbenga. Turns out, in a big plot twist, Una is a genetically engineered Illyrian. Spock discovers that the Illyrians were wiped out by a mysterious disease around the same time that the plasma creatures first appeared. But there's no record of the creatures causing harm to the colonists. As the dangerous storm comes in, which is lethal to organic life, the plasma creatures surround Pike and Spock, protecting them until the storm subsides. Back on the ship, Una's metabolism has beaten the virus, but there's no means of synthesizing an antibody. La'an wakes up and heads to engineering. She disables the warp containment field and nearly destroys the ship. Una has to fight her while La'an calls her an abomination and expresses her disgust at being lied to by Una for years. The fact that Una is essentially an augment cuts to the core of La'an, what with the fact that she was bullied as a child for being descended from Khan Noonien Singh. Again, the idea that she's a relative of Khan and that she served aboard the Enterprise prior to Space Seed is just ridiculous. Anyway, Una saves the day, and as the warp core goes critical, she glows red. On the planet, Spock deduces that the colonists basically became the plasma energy when some of them ran towards the storms when they were driven mad by the virus symptoms. The charged storm particles bonded with their electromagnetic presence. It is a bit of an overly elaborate explanation, to be quite frank. Suddenly, one particular cylinder pops out of the wall with records about how the colonists intended to renounce their genetic engineering to join the Federation. Even in death, they wanted the Federation to know who they really were. As Pike laments, they wanted to join the Federation so badly, their good faith gesture got them killed. So, the conclusion to the problem on the Enterprise is quite lame. In a very contrived medical explanation that sounds very unbelievable, La'an's proximity to Una in engineering during the radiation exposure was enough to heal both of them. How does that work? Nurse Chapel says that La'an got chimeric antibodies from Una. Okay. Chapel then went on to synthesize them into a cure for everyone else. It all feels a bit Deus Ex Machina by the end. Una surrenders herself for disciplinary review for lying to enter Starfleet and not revealing that she was A. Illyrian and B. genetically engineered. Pike refuses to accept her resignation, saying that she is the best first officer in the fleet and that what he learned on the surface is that Illyrians are severely misunderstood. Her actions prove that. She defies every stereotype the Federation has about Illyrians, and that she's a very good example of one. The plot point about her being genetically engineered and keeping it a secret is clearly very reminiscent of similar revelations about Julian Bashir on Deep Space Nine. So again, this isn't very original. But there's one last loose end to tie up. Una has to figure out why the biofilter in the transporter had a problem that allowed this light infection to come aboard the ship in the first place, so she goes to visit Mbenga in sickbay. She tells him that it was his medical transporter that inhibited the biofilters. He didn't allow them upgrade the medical transporter when they were in space dock. He has to admit something I didn't see coming. Turns out his daughter has been sick, she's dying, and he's been keeping her in the pattern buffer. Sort of like how Scotty stored himself in a transporter buffer in the Next Generation episode Relics. By all rights, Mbenga's actions, although unintentionally so, did jeopardize the entire crew, and although he is willing to be disciplined for it, Una, like Pike, shows him mercy also, and has a dedicated power source set up from the warp core to make sure there's no future problems. He can continue to work on developing a cure for his daughter, who he regularly has to dematerialize in order to maintain her pattern. He reads her a story at the end of the episode. A very unbelievable conclusion, in my view. Now, if protocol was actually being followed here, both he and Una would be dismissed from Starfleet. But they're regular characters on the show, so obviously that's not going to happen. Ghosts of Illyria is actually a decent enough Star Trek episode, but it's ultimately just another one of those cliched virus stories where the crew goes a bit loopy, and we've seen that kind of thing plenty of times on Star Trek, to the point where it's almost a bit of a trope. Moreover, the solution to the problem is, as I described, very clunky and unbelievable. But that being said, after 3 episodes, I can say that Strange New Worlds is proving to be much better than Discovery or Picard, and the standalone format, which is much more in keeping with the franchise roots, is genuinely serving the show very well. The cast is very good, although I'm not totally sold on the character of Hemmer just yet, although I think Bruce Horak's performance is very good indeed. But I can see what they're trying to do with the character. Maybe he's supposed to be a kind of likeable, cantankerous rogue, like the EMH Doctor from Voyager in the first couple of seasons. But right now, Hemmer seems a bit wooden and one-dimensional. His character just needs a lot more fleshing out, or otherwise he runs the risk of being the borderline insubordinate asshole on the ship, and we already have La'an for that. As I've said, the show is very derivative and not particularly original, feeling very much like a modern rehash of the original series. But that's just the way I see it right now. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the show can't be a fun time. Although it does feel like the writers are genuinely trying to produce some decent standalone science fiction here, fun is the very thing the series needs a lot more of. That seems to be the one thing that's really missing for me. The 3 stories so far feel a little bit too much like cookie-cutter, generic, safe Star Trek stories, and just lack much imagination or any kind of wow factor or sense of excitement, tension, suspense, or wonder. I'd be more than happy to see the series find another gear. Lord knows Star Trek has suffered enough in terms of poor quality writing and stories in recent years. It could use a return to form, and if Strange New Worlds helps the franchise turn the corner and begins delivering great science fiction television once again, I'd be very pleased indeed. I am a Star Trek fan after all. For now, the one positive I will say after 3 episodes is that I'm far more content continuing to watch and review this series than either Discovery or Picard. Strange New Worlds isn't bad, it's better than both of those shows. It's just not great. It can take a couple of seasons for a Trek show to really establish itself, so let's hope that it can achieve that a little sooner.